Welcome to the Coming Home Well podcast, the show that educates, supports, and advocates for the veteran community. Your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, U.S. Army retired, will bring you exciting conversations with amazing guests about resources, research, and military history, all geared to helping our warriors to come home well. Here's your host, Dr. Tyler Piron.
Welcome back to Coming Home Well. I'm your host, Dr. Tyler Piron, and today we are going to talk about something that is very important, the support network for our spouses and family members and all the people that are not serving, but are serving with us. As they go and are all around the world, all of a sudden they're thrown into these new environments and new places and really a new culture. And all of a sudden, they're having to adapt, and it's really tough. It's really tough for the service member, but there's lots of resources for service members in and out of service. All the family members and all the people around the military, it's not as easy. There isn't as many resources. Now, things are getting better, and there's more organizations and more of an awareness within the services that these things are important, but not nearly to the degree that it really matters, because let's be honest, so much of the military is still focused on the spouse stays at home, takes care of the kids, and it's like the 1960s. That's sort of the ideal military thought. Now, we know that isn't true. We know that that isn't reality. We know that so many of our spouses are just as educated or more educated than the service member in many cases. And all of a sudden, they're thrown into this whole new mix where there's this sort of expectation of things. So we have Evie King, who is with Independent, and it's all about a positive and inclusive military spouse wellness community. And that's a lot of words to describe something that's pretty cool. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And I love the way that you have described the military spouse experience so far. You're very in touch with what modern military spouses, I think, experience right now.
It's been an ongoing thing for many years. It's evolved a little bit, but it's not easy. It's never been easy. Fortunately, my spouse was in the military, so I saw it where she was here and serving, and so we have always had that sort of connection. But there's a lot of people that are around the military that it's all brand new. Now, you have a little bit of a background in the military, so you didn't come into it like a lamb to the slaughter. What's your first experience to the military?
Well, I am an Army brat. So I was born, so my dad was Army, but because he was Signal Corps, we had more Air Force assignments than Army. So I was actually born at Peterson Air Force Base, now the current home of the Space Force out in Colorado. And then we lived in Izmir, Turkey, which was another Air Force location. But again, my dad was Army. And then my dad was finally stationed at Fort Monmouth, which is where he got out of the Army back in the 90s. But both of my parents were Army. My mom was a nurse in the Army, but she got out to have children. It's something that she's always wanted to do. So I'm one of 6. And I was actually one of the few who said I never wanted to have anything to do with the Army. And yet I'm now the only one who has anything to do with the Army. None of my siblings went into the military, but I married a service member. And I to this day, I think that's the only reason that my dad remembered John's name while we were dating. Everyone else always had like a nickname.
The current boyfriend, as it was.
Exactly. Something like, how is that guy? But John was in ROTC at the time, and it was something that him and my dad bonded over.
Oh, that's awesome. So you guys dated all through through college, and then got married, and now I'm sure you've bounced from assignment to assignment.
Yes, we did. So we actually dated later in our college. John graduated almost a month after we started dating. So we were kind of back and forth between is it serious or is it not? But he actually got into the National Guard first. So my first deployment experience was back when the New Jersey National Guard deployed to Iraq. And I was not living in New Jersey at the time. The day that John left was the day that I got in my little Honda Civic and drove to my first post-college job in Ohio. So I was it was actually great practice for the military, because the first time I went to IKEA, I had this grand plan of like, oh, I'm going to outfit my home. Well, I stood in the self-serve area by myself and realized that everything on my list was way too heavy for me to carry by myself and way too big to fit in my car. So before even marrying into the military, I had to get comfortable asking someone who I had just met, hey, friend, I know we just met. Would you mind driving, 2.5 hours to IKEA with me with your truck and helping me buy furniture?
That's so relatable, because I know everybody goes to IKEA and
yes.
And goes and like, oh, this box is way bigger than my car.
Yes, way bigger and way heavier. I don't know why I thought pieces of furniture were not as heavy as the piece of furniture itself. Like for some reason, breaking it down seemed like it would be lighter, but it was not. And I lived on the second floor of an apartment that did not have any elevator. So that was my first experience where I learned like, oh, you are going to have to ask a stranger for help. And that's an uncomfortable feeling, because you just met this person. What if they don't like you? What if they think you're annoying? All of those insecurities come up. But honestly, that experience has really served me well in the military, because since marrying my spouse, and they're gone so often, not just during deployment, which I think is a really big myth for many civilians, is they think that when they're home, but often they're traveling, they're going to trainings, they're at work really, really late. And so you have to learn in many ways to be self-sufficient, but that does not mean you have to do everything alone. But you do have to get comfortable with asking people who you just met to help you with things. But what I've noticed throughout the entire 11 and a half years of being married so far, everyone is always so willing to say yes, because we've all been there before. And that has been just one of the most wonderful things. Even civilians will want to help, because I think it's just human nature, honestly, to want to help people.
I think that is so true. And it's the biggest gap is asking for help. And that's one of the things that I'm always trying to push is, hey, there are a million resources out there, right? And people want to help. There are so many people that if they knew about a need, they'd be the first to go, hey, can I help you? But they don't know about it. And they don't know your private struggles, or even trying to get some furniture up onto a second floor apartment because you're a single person, whose boyfriend is deployed and you're moving. And they're like, it's simple stuff, but right. Who do you ask, and how do you ask, and how do you sort of reach out and ask someone? And, I've noticed that if you ask like to the void, it doesn't work very well. If you ask a person, they're almost always going to say, yes, I'd love to help you. But if you go into a Facebook group or something and you're like, hey, I need some help, and you'll hear crickets.
Yeah, I have noticed that more so in the States, but honestly overseas. So right now my husband is stationed in Baumholder, Germany. We have all of these Facebook groups, and people do ask those questions in there, and random strangers are all willing to help. And it's been really wonderful to see that, because living overseas in many ways can feel a little bit more isolating, because your neighbors don't speak the same language. They have a different culture. Many of them sometimes don't even understand why you're there. Now, granted, we're in a very heavily U.S. military area. The Army has a huge presence here, the Air Force. So they've gotten used to Americans being here. But you can ask into the void here. And I have to say, I've just been very surprised, because my experience back in the States is not that. You do need to ask specific people. And that's something that I have found. So they always say asking for help is a sign of strength. And it really is true. But how can the established community, sort of help alleviate some of that burden? Because when you're moving to a new area, kind of like what you talked about earlier, military spouses are having to learn how to adapt and everything. we're already having to overcome so many different challenges that sometimes asking for help can seem like this really huge mountain to overcome because we have just dealt with so many other things. And so I always wonder, how can the established community who doesn't have all those hurdles so close together alleviate some of that? And that's something that at Independent we really try to do, is try to give the military spouse community the confidence to have some conversations with each other that maybe they wouldn't feel comfortable or confident having without some of these tools or help or anything like that.
That's a really good point. I didn't think about it, but a closed environment, a closed community like Baumholder. I spent 3 years there in the mid 90s, or 2 years, I guess. And then I went to Heidelberg. But
it has not changed.
It has not changed. I actually was there not too long ago, and it was driving through. It was like a flashback because the buildings are the exact same. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a few new places. But it doesn't look as run down. There's some upgrades and things, because there was talk about closing it back in the 90s during the BRAC. And so they were upgrading all the buildings to turn it over to the Germans. And I was like, well, that makes no sense. and so I was actually in the first buildings as you enter not the housing on the right, but first old school buildings up in the center, where the old German barracks, with the two on each side and the one headquarters in the middle. And they renovated them. And so we moved over to Eder Oberstein, which is about 30 minutes away. And it was wonderful to be away. And now all that is shut down. I was talking to some other folks. I didn't go over there this last trip, but I was like, oh, I was over there. And they're like, yeah. So I actually walked through the old barracks buildings where I was. And it's a very small, very insular, but very large community. It's kind of weird. It seems like it wouldn't be that big, but there's a lot of people there.
There is, but we share a lot of the services with the Kaiserslautern area, mm-hmm. which is 50 minutes to an hour away. And a lot of the people who handle the social services on base live in the Kaiserslautern area. And so the needs that Baumholder has are not their immediate needs because it's not impacting their family. So right now, and not a topic really to go into, Kaiserslautern or Baumholder is experiencing some really bad water quality issues. I mean, people are taking pictures of like green gook coming out of their drinking water. And they're all talking about like, everyone put in ice complaints, everyone do this. And I'm sitting here going like, why is the community having to band together to ask someone to check in on their water quality? That one person should be enough, because that is disgusting. It's literally a
health issue.
Right. But the people who are dealing, no one who would be making the decisions is living on Baumholder. And so it's not something that is immediately impacting their family. And that just seems to be the issue with a lot of things that happen in that community, but that's not uncommon.
It's very common in the military.
Very common, and very common for OCONUS locations, especially the smaller bases where, their garrison is located hours away. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we take care of it when we get to it. It's yes. So you have formed this group. It's called Independent. And it's a 501c3, and it is all about helping military spouses do what?
So we want to give military spouses access to the information and resources they need to make healthy decisions for themselves and their families. So being military spouses ourselves, but also just from what we have noticed, especially in the community, the military spouse tends to be the constant in the family, unless you have dual military, in which case, obviously, those are a little bit different. And obviously, single soldiers have a different experience. But for married families, it's the military spouse who is the constant in the family. So they're the ones generally who are making a lot of the home decisions, a lot of the food decisions. They're the ones who are, often in charge of, if they have children, their schedules, et cetera, whatever that happens to be. And so we realized that a lot of the resources out there were talking about health and wellness from the perspective of the service member, or how to help the service member. So, for example, in the topic of, say, substance use, if you Google substance use for service or military spouses, it's always the military spouse helping the service member. It's not the other way around. If, like, the military spouse, for example, was the one. Topics or conversations and everything talking about how do we help military children through many of those transitions, because it is very hard on them, especially depending on what sort of time of year or what age group they fall into. But no one was really speaking to the military spouse wellness experience and addressing the needs from, hey, by the way, military spouse, we know that you always put the needs of your family above your own, sometimes the military community, but you also need to take care of yourself. So how do we do that? How do we educate them on what already exists? And then what Independent then does is we try to fill in the gaps if no one is talking about either a specific subject or a specific need. We approach wellness from 4 different branches, all rooted in military life. So wellness in itself is not unique to military life, right? It's deeply personal, but also extremely universal. We all need to eat well. We all, have adverse effects if we don't sleep, if we don't move our bodies. But what makes our approach different and our needs different are then the challenges that the military life places on that. And what we have also noticed in our time, serving and educating on these resources and information is the lack of data out there about the specific needs of military spouses. And so that's really been interesting to navigate, because being military spouses ourselves, it's unique because we experience the same things that we're trying to remove. So our mission is to make wellness accessible. And what that means is removing barriers to wellness, be that cost, location, time, anything that you could consider a barrier to accessing the information that you need to make healthy decisions for yourself and your family. But because we are also the people that we're serving, sometimes it means that we are caught up in our own experiences. And so it's important to have that information so that we truly are addressing the needs of the population in general. And it's also just helpful to know what those are in terms of location, because, for example, one of the things that we're doing right now is we talk a lot about how do we nourish our families, especially as more and more information comes up about food insecurity within the military community. So we're not the ones giving military families food, right? So many other organizations are doing that. Our approach is to educate and teach military spouses how to shop, how to prepare food, keeping in mind time, stress, right? One of the big myths about eating healthy at home is that it is expensive and that it is time consuming. So how do we address all of these things? Well, telling a military spouse in Fort Irwin, California, who is an hour to an hour and a half away, maybe from some other grocery stores besides the commissary,
just go to Whole Foods. It'll be fine.
Yeah,
you can pick up this unique thing.
It's very different than what you would say to a military spouse who's stationed in Washington, D.C., who has a plethora of different options to choose from, but are very, very expensive options. And so the approach has to be a little bit different, because the last thing we want a military spouse to feel when they read something is to go, oh, well, that doesn't take into account my circumstances, right? Which is why we'll never tell a military spouse they need to do a digital detox, because if you tell a spouse that the only way that they're going to have any sort of peace about, having their phone attached to their hip is to never look at it, and then yet that's their connection to their loved ones and their family members, it sets them up to already feel like, well, that's a failure, right? I'm never going to be able to incorporate that. So we always try to incorporate the circumstances and the possibilities when we're talking to the military spouses that we're serving.
I always found it interesting as an observation is that the things that are sometimes overwhelming when you're a new military person or spouse, when you talk to the people who've been around a while, they're like, oh, that's no big deal. Oh, that's so easy. But at the time, it feels overwhelming. It could be as simple as trying to get your kids in the child development center, and you don't understand that process, or the hours of the commissary, or even the tipping for the baggers at the commissary.
Right.
And it's these little things that just seem overwhelming because it's new and you're not familiar with it. But then, people have been around a while. They've acclimated, they sort of get it, and they don't recognize how challenging that is to the people that are just joining, it's new to them.
Yes. Yeah. I actually recently had that experience when we were moving, and I had to sort of check myself because I think this is our fourth move with the military, our second overseas, and another military spouse, they married later in their spouse's career. And we were going through the PCS around the same time because both of our service members were coming back from a deployment, and then both were PCSing at the same time. They were staying Kona, so they were going to New York. And the paperwork was slow, all of these different things, scheduling was not happening 3 months out. And she was very nervous because this was her first PCS. She was very, very nervous about the timeline and how and all this other stuff. And like, oh, I don't have this yet, so I can't do this. And me, I'm just sitting here thinking like, well, the Army wants my spouse there. I know it's going to happen. It's fine. It's not a big deal. It always ends up working out. And then I realized like that is completely unhelpful, Evie, because one, this is a very real experience for her right now. She's very stressed out about this. You remember how that was now that
it's the fear of the unknown.
Go through it.
Yeah.
And we need to be compassionate about other people's experiences, even though we might know that it will all end up working out in the end, because at the time you didn't know that, and it was very, very stressful.
And it is stressful. I mean, my wife and I moved every 18 months. And so we were constantly moving one place to another. And it was, we were pretty easy. We didn't have kids at the time. And so we were pretty flexible, and we were traveling a lot for work. And so it was kind of normal for us. At the same time, trying to coordinate schedules, and we were driving from South Carolina to DC, and trying to see each other on weekends, and while one is moved, the other hasn't yet, and things like that. And so it gets challenging. And so these accommodations you make sound crazy to someone on the outside. Like, you drove 8 hours to spend the weekend with your spouse? Yes, I did.
Yeah.
That's normal. That is, the extra things you do to have a normal life. But
absolutely,
it sounds crazy to someone on the outside.
It does. I would say that the driving distance, what is considered normal for a military family, is completely abnormal for many people. I mean, it is not unusual for a military family to find out. So we were at Fort Leavenworth, and we had friends who were stationed out by St. Louis, which is easily a 5.5, 6 hour drive. And we saw them as frequently as we possibly could because, quote, the military put us, quote, close together.
Right.
And telling people that like, oh yeah, I'm going to go drive 6 hours just to see a friend of ours for the weekend, and doing that as many times as you possibly could while you were stationed 6 hours from each other for a year is crazy to some people. And, similar to you, my spouse and I, before we got married, we would see each other on the weekend, and we would meet up every other weekend in the middle, which was Kentucky. And there are not that many places to meet up in Kentucky that are interesting. And it was so difficult to have a life when you do that, because you don't realize how much you do on the weekends, like just errands, cleaning your house. And now when you're going to see someone every other weekend, you don't have that time, and then you're trying to squeeze it into the work week. It was exhausting. It was very exhausting, but I am so glad we did it, because he deployed not long after. And I would have been way more upset knowing that I spent those weekends catching up on housework than being together.
Yeah, doing laundry
Right.
doesn't overcome
No,
quality time.
exactly. Yes.
So you
Yeah.
guys
So
have a
time has a
number.
little bit of a, I don't know, has a different feeling. There's a little bit more
Right.
of that feeling of urgency, and every moment needs to count. So yeah, we drive
Quality
peak hours.
time. It's
Yeah,
one of
yeah.
those where quality time really means something, not just spending
Mhm.
time together, but spending time together intensely, I guess is the case.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you guys have a number of programs to help folks, spouses and family members that are around, because you brought up something, and I sort of just want to circle back on it, is the food insecurity. We've
Mm.
actually had a number of shows on it. It's a huge issue, both for people that are active duty and not just food insecurity, but eating well. It's
Yes.
kind of both. Food insecurity is a huge issue for a lot of people in the military, but also a lot of veterans. But
Right.
then eating well when you're in can be
Mm.
just as challenging. The dining facilities, God bless them, they try. I was recently at the Grafenveer main shopping area where we would often go to lunch, and they'd have these posters about how to eat healthy. And
Right.
literally all the restaurants was a Taco Bell, a Popeye's chicken, O'Charlie's subs, a Pizza Hut, and then a Subway. And so
Right.
they had these signs about like how you could order healthy things from these places. And I'm like sort of laughing to myself going, that is not it, Joe. Yeah, that's not how this thing works. But, but then they have the dining facilities for the service members, but that doesn't help everybody else.
No, no. Even though I've eaten at plenty of them, I've never eaten at one without my spouse. So our Fuel the Homefront program, it was designed by a dietitian, and the purpose of it was to educate military families on how to nourish their families. And we say nourish because it's not just putting food in our bodies, but the type of food, right? If we're going to teach people, because again, one of the big myths about eating healthy is that it has to be expensive and time consuming. And so we really wanted to address that because, again, there are wonderful organizations out there who are doing food drives. There are wonderful organizations who are lobbying on sort of the long-term solutions so that food insecurity is not an issue. But while it is, military families, they're still having to shop. They're still having to decide on what they're going to feed their families that month or that week. And so we wanted to address that. And so honestly, Fuel the Homefront, anybody can take advantage of it. Everyone, I think, can benefit from learning how to eat healthy on a budget while also considering time and stress. We also talk about how to eat out because if you're moving, if you're going to visit family, you're, potentially going to also eat out. I don't like packing a whole bunch of sandwiches in a cooler. It's just not something that I like to do. There are military families out there who will take their Instant Pot in their car, freezer bag meals, and they'll make them in the hotel room. And, and
that's really smart, but that is also extra.
It is. And so, again, it's not realistic for everybody. So we talk about how do you also incorporate eating out? How do you create a meal plan that takes into account the changing week? Because you might go into a week thinking, oh, I'm going to eat 5 meals at home. And the next thing you know, a kid's practice went late, or your spouse isn't home, or you forgot something that you had to go to a potluck. And so we really try to incorporate all of that. But we talk about price comparisons. We talk about what cuts of meat are going to be not only just healthy, but also more affordable. We talk about ways to stretch food. We talk about ways to reduce waste, right? We Americans throw out, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but a ton of food. And so how do we kind of keep all that in mind? And all of that can help reduce your grocery costs. So again, Fuel the Homefront, while yes, it is sort of our approach to that, it's also our way to help military families nourish their families. Because the other part is that our service members, by nature of their job, do have to meet certain height and weight standards. And so instead of the month before your PT test, you're making like really extreme changes in order to pass that test. Why not incorporate those changes throughout, the entirety of the year or your life? And then, you won't have to buy really expensive supplements, et cetera, whatever that happens to be. So we wanted to create a program that taught just sustainable, healthy eating that took into account cost, took into account time, took into account food waste, et cetera, and our ever-changing needs. So right now the course is a live workshop. So we offer it virtually. Again, one of the ways that we make wellness accessible, it doesn't matter where you live, you can attend, but because it is live, it is dependent on time zone. And right now, the dietitian, Heather, who teaches it, she is stationed out in Alaska. So we obviously have to work with her time. But we were recently given some funding, and now we're going to take the workshop and turn it to an on-demand course. So no matter where a military spouse is, they can take our Fuel the Home Front course. And then that will also allow us to add different modules. Are you in a food desert? Are you overseas? And so we can add some different modules that will, again, help that military spouse no matter where they're located. Are you going through a deployment solo? Do you have young growing children? How do you help them, picky eaters, whatever it happens to be? So we're very excited about that. And hopefully that will be going live before the end of this year.
No, that is really awesome. I think back and I cringe about how poorly I ate, because it was easier to eat cheap food. And cheap food, I mean prepackaged, prepared, throw it in the microwave, boom, you're done. And it is really healthy or it's really filling. It's not super healthy, but it was very filling. It was cheaper.
Right. And it was fast.
It was fast, but it wasn't really healthy and it wasn't really cheaper if you really look at it. But for me at the time, and now I'm like, oh, yes, we buy 50-pound bags of rice, and put it into containers. And so, we have rice all the time. It's just and it's the price for like 2 pounds of rice at the grocery store is the same price you'll pay for 50 pounds if you go to one of the, like Asian food market. Yeah. And it's one of those little things that I've learned over the years going, oh, I was paying a lot for very little and it would take me forever to cook. And, now I love rice cookers and, using the Instapot to make rice and things like that is healthy that you don't think about. And that's why I think this course and that effort of yours is so important, because then you could scale it. Like, we have 3 kids. So there's 5 of us. My wife doesn't eat meat. So we are constantly adjusting what we can have and what works for everybody. And then kids are all in different sports and different practices and weekends and all the things that every military spouse is dealing with, whether it's a deployment or just everyday life with kids doing lots of stuff. All of a sudden, it's got to be flexible.
Correct.
So you guys also do a wellness summit, and I think that's pretty important.
Yes, so that's probably our longest running program. So Independent has been around since 2013, but we were not a nonprofit then. We were just a program underneath. So it's called fiscally sponsored. We fell under another nonprofit in order to be able to do the programs that we wanted to do and accept donations. I am not one of the founders, but I have been with the organization since 2016 when all of the founders were still really involved. And in 2015, they started what was then called the Military Spouse Wellness Summit. The idea was they wanted to host an event, but being military spouses themselves, they were not stationed anywhere near each other. So how do you host a wellness event that anybody can attend? And they decided to do it virtually, which back in 2015,
That was a big deal.
Honestly, the pandemic, we were still having to explain to people what a virtual military spouse event was. People did not understand that. So I would say for us, it's probably the only positive to come out of the fact that, now everyone understands what a virtual event is. But back in 2015, it was unheard of. I don't want to say we were the original, the OG, but I'm pretty sure we were, especially the military spouse space. What we did is we interviewed 10 experts on various military or various wellness topics. They are not always military related. So we have had Gretchen Rubin, for example, New York Times best-selling author, but she is not at all a military spouse or military connected at all. But our hosts are military spouses themselves. And so what they do is they bring in the military spouse perspective from these experts in the space. But we do have a kind of a variety. So we have military spouse wellness experts and not. And again, the idea is we want to introduce military spouses to thinking about wellness from just different perspectives. And we have had spouses who have come back to us later and re-listened to one of the interviews, because the nice thing about being virtual, they can be accessed at any time. And they've said that, at the time, these certain things stood out to me. And then years later, they went back and they listened to it. And then other things that were said during the interview stood out. And, each time you're going to come out of it learning something different. So we have had summits. This will be our 8th one in 2023. So we've had 7, and each one of them is a little bit themed. Last year was flourish. So we focused on, how do we flourish in our lives? There's so many opportunities around us, but then we try to take a little bit of a creative spin on that flourish. So we had a doctor who is a military spouse talking about gut microbes, because that's part of our system needs to flourish. And she also brought in the fact that military families are sometimes living in homes with mold. How does that impact your life? What changes can you incorporate if you're experiencing a home with mold? We also had someone who's a military spouse, and she's a tidying expert. And she talked about, how having a tidy home will help you flourish in your life. And so we don't just approach it from the literal sense. We try to also be creative with it, but we address, we've addressed many different topics. We try to balance it between like the heavier wellness topics. So we almost always have a topic or an interview having to do with stress. Sometimes we'll have someone, so mental health. Sometimes we'll have someone talk about financial wellness. We'll have someone talk about community or social. So we had an interview between 3 military spouses from different parts of life. One of them, English was not her first language. Another one of them was a male military spouse. Our host again was a military spouse. So she brought in that perspective and talked about how do we build a community? What are some of the challenges that some of these other smaller demographics experience when they come in? And then how can the military spouse community at large then support them when they join in? And so it's one of my favorite programs, because each year we're allowed to explore just wellness from so many different angles, because each year is 10. This year, what is unique about it is we always poll military spouses afterwards and say, hey, what do you want us to cover next year? And when I say military spouses, we mean everybody. It's not just active duty. It is retired, National Guard, reserves. We don't care. If you're, once a military spouse, always a military spouse. And we even open it up to service member, significant others if they would like.
Evie, I was looking on your website and I saw something called Wellness Unfiltered. And I thought that was really important, because there are so many things that are, sensitive, or somebody doesn't want to bring up, or sort of challenging to talk about because of whatever reason, if social taboos or just like being uncomfortable. What is Wellness Unfiltered?
So, Wellness Unfiltered is our way to have difficult conversations that many people are curious about or might be experiencing, but maybe don't know where to turn first, or someone might be experiencing it in their surroundings and they don't know how to help that person or have a conversation about it. So some of the topics that we have covered have been alcohol use. So if you are either going through that or maybe have someone in your community who is, or what to look out for. We've had conversations around abuse, marital abuse. We've had conversations around miscarriage. And, again, we want to give military spouses the confidence to be there for their fellow military spouse who might experience that, because sometimes these conversations can come up really early on in a military spouse's friendship, because that's just the nature of the game. You become really close to people that you just met. And when this happens, the last thing we want someone to feel is that they don't know what to say next, or they don't know how to support that person, or they don't know just how to be there for them. And so that's when Wellness Unfiltered sort of started, is just a safe space to have these conversations. So military spouses will come to us when they have a topic that they're willing to be open about, or we'll talk with an expert about it. And we're very honored that people are trusting us with their stories, because again, these are kind of tougher subjects. But wellness is not just how to eat well, how to reduce stress, how to move your body. There are some really serious issues that we face in the military spouse space, and we want to make sure to address those.
That is really important. I was so surprised because, a lot of times things go surface level,
Yes.
How to eat well, and, how to manage kids' schedules and all these things. But there's a lot of things, especially in the military, there's unique stressors, and people sometimes don't deal with them in the most healthy ways. So a lot of alcohol abuse, a lot of pressures, and sometimes people blow up at home. And so we've read the news, we see the challenges that the military face because of these challenges. And so having a place to be able to get some resources and talk to someone, and am I crazy for feeling this way? And that's a very common thing. Right. And they're not crazy. It's just, it's a crazy situation sometimes.
Right. And most people aren't going to talk about them. And again, that's why we think that it's so important to have that space, because when you're experiencing it, someone is searching for that information. And I always feel like the last thing I want someone to do is to go somewhere, search for something, and then feel that their experience or their situation is not being covered. And when we've talked with people about it, why no one's really talking about it, it's because it's they're uncomfortable subjects. And again, because we are the military spouses that we serve, we don't feel that we can truly support military spouses if we're not talking about these tougher subjects and bringing them up, because they do happen. And that is something that needs, a safe space. So again, we talk with experts about certain topics, but if someone comes to us with a story, we say, do you want us to use your name? Do you want us to change it? Do you want us to talk about it more in the third person? So we really try to honor their story as much as possible. And then when we talk with an expert about it, we ask really tough questions. We ask the questions that we think that either people give us or we think people would want to know. And often we will preface it with, hey, this conversation might get a little bit uncomfortable, but that's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing.
Absolutely. I was sort of surprised, but it made so much sense to me. I was reading the website and they had an article back in February about painful intercourse and all the causes and the reasons. And it's not, necessarily like, oh, there's some marital discord or something. It's often physiological. There's, childbirth and hormones and all the things that people go through, but it can cause such marital issues that if you think about, oh, I'm this, that, but the article was great because it was talking about here's the problems and here's the solutions and here's how to get help. And it's sort of factual based and with some humor built into it. And that's what I was like, well, that's a great type of article because it's universal, but if you're isolated, you're back out and you're, seeing a foreign medical provider that may have a different culture, they may not be able to address it, or you're going to the low base hospital, that is not something you may want to talk with some medical provider that has friends or somebody these things are all important things to consider. So it was a unique sort of topic to discuss, but I'm sure that it matters a lot to a lot of people that are having challenges.
Well, it's interesting that you say that because, so we talked about the summit very briefly. We've had a sex therapist on there twice already. Because, the way that I think about it is we are military spouses. We are married. Marital relations are happening. And that is part of our well-being, not only, our physical well-being, but our relationship well-being. A strong military marriage is a very important component of our overall well-being, right? And so to not talk about that subject because it's uncomfortable is leaving out an extremely important part of a happy marriage for a lot of people. And so we talk about intimacy, and because again, going off of the fact that military marriage, wellness is rooted in military life, some people are separated from their spouse for months at a time, or geobatching, or doing all of these things. And again, a lot of conventional marriage experts are not talking about that, but they can throw some interesting circumstances into the mix. And then you have military spouses who are feeling very uncomfortable, not knowing who to turn to and thinking, well, then this must be normal, or am I the only one experiencing this? And so again, we want to bring it up because it's happening. So then they can search for it and then read it and go, oh, what I'm experiencing is normal. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with my marriage with my spouse. These are, like you said, physiological, or maybe there's some mental things that you guys have to work through, but it can get better. And again, we want people to feel hopeful and know that there are realistic possibilities and things that they can do to improve.
You bring up a really interesting point. I mean, if you go to a marriage therapist and every other year we're separated for 6 months to a year. And then when they're home, they're gone. They work all day. They work 12-hour days, and then they're gone for weeks at a time. Most therapists be like, are you sure you're really married?
Right.
Right, because that is not normal. They're trying to avoid you or something like that. Obviously, we know that isn't the case. Uncle Sam has a lot of things for a lot of people to do, and often it involves going other places to do it. So it's normal in context, but abnormal in a normal relationship outside of the military. And so accounting for those differences is really important.
Right.
So independent is been around for 10 years, in various forms, and sort of evolved and become bigger and better. And you've got the summit, and you've got a number of resources. The website, and I'm going to put it up on the Coming Home Well Facebook page and all the social medias. And so you guys don't have to write it down, but it's in-dependent.org. So independent in-dependent.org. It's easy to find. There's a ton of articles and resources and links and ways to get in touch with them. Evie, what should I have asked you about but didn't?
Well, you sort of brought up the fact that we've been around for 10 years, and this is our 10-year anniversary this October. So what does the next 10 years look like for Independent? And right now, our website is getting a redesign. We're getting a brand refresh. We're going to be posting our newest course, like I mentioned. Our summit this year is going to be different because we're deep diving parenting for 5 of the interviews. We've never done that before, but we did a survey recently where we asked military spouses, what is it that you need? Because the next 10 years is going to look very different for military spouses, right? The deployments are different. And already we're seeing the changes that they're happening. So I'm in a number of groups. And before, there was sort of like a shared like misery in a way, with the military spouse being left home and then the service member being stuck in some base in Afghanistan where you have your MWR and whatever. But now deployments are happening to Europe, and you're having military spouses whose soldiers are being able to go out on the weekends, who are getting to go to restaurants, who are going to movies. Yet for the military spouse who's staying home, our experience has not changed much. We're still holding down the home front, still doing everything for the children back home, still worried. And it's causing some interesting marital issues. And so the next 10 years of how independent is going to be serving those needs, we're going to have to change, because the deployments aren't the same, the missions aren't the same. And honestly, the military spouses and the service members who are joining are different. They get their information different. And so we have to adapt to those. We have to meet the military spouses where they're at. So I'm very excited what the next 10 years are going to look like, because the last 10 years have been awesome, but the next 10 years are really going to be a fun challenge.
You bring up such an interesting point, like, deploying to Poland or even to Grafenwehr and Holmesfels, or, sort of training places where you can go out to eat, and you go out to the restaurants, you go to the movies, you go shopping. It's one thing when your spouse is deployed and it sucks.
Yes.
And, there's nothing there. You might have a green beans, you might have an MWR, but it sucks. All right. As opposed to, they're on vacation.
It can seem that way.
Right. I often get that because, I stay in this little German town every time I go to Graf, and, it's beautiful. And I go out to, world-class restaurants, and my wife is like, boy, it looks really tough there. Right. And, I'm like, well, yes, it's a long day, but, you got to eat. And
right. Yeah.
It's not a typical deployment, but that's sort of the concept. Yeah. The idea of that, it sucks. So, I can't get upset when they're spending money or, things like that, versus they're going out to the movies and shopping and restaurants and
eating all the delicious baked goods.
Right. And doing all the things while I'm at home doing everything that needs to be done.
Correct. Right. Exactly. And I think what I'm seeing is there's some interesting resentment that's building up. But then you also have to think about it from the service member's perspective. Like, I didn't ask to leave. Like, I want to be home too. Mm-hmm. And so it's very, very interesting. So these are the sorts of conversations that we're having now. Like, how is this going to impact military marriages? Because honestly, having lived in South Korea, it impacted a lot of military marriages in not a very good way when their service member went there without them. It is very hard when you have some of those freedoms that they did not have when they were deployed to the Middle East. Yes, a lot of resentment can happen, a lot of money spending. So again, going back to, the financial well-being of the family, it's a lot harder to spend money when you are in Afghanistan than you are living, in Europe or in South Korea. So I really, the way that we're going to be supporting military marriages and military spouses going forward is not the way that we have done it. And so we need to be able to be flexible and agile with those needs, and also with technology, because that changes as well. And technology is our main use of connecting military spouses to this information.
Very interesting observations. Obviously, you're very much closer to it than I am. And so I hadn't thought of it like that before. So these are the sort of things that I think are super helpful for military spouses, whether they're male or female. Because as I mentioned at the very beginning, the idealism of the 1960s of it's a wife staying at home with the kids is sometimes sort of baked in, especially at the junior officer level, just because, historical. I think as we become more senior in rank and experience, people recognize that there's a lot more dynamic environment. Not everybody belongs to the wives club. And, it's not like the movies back in the day. We have a lot of very professional spouses that are out there that are teachers and nurses and doctors and you name it. that are trying to have a career and try to work and try to do the same things that they were doing before they joined the military by proxy. And all of a sudden, that's a huge challenge of trying to get licenses and all these things and fit into a whole different culture, a whole different environment, which is why I think Independent is a great resource for anybody who is dealing with these things or may be dealing with it. Or, this is importantly, if you know someone that might be dealing with this in the future, let them know about it. We'll put up the website on all the social media so you guys don't have to write it down, but it's in-dependent.org. Evie, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well. I'm really appreciative of all the things you're doing for military spouses. It is a huge underserved community, and there's a lot of things to make it better. Maybe not great, but I think it can be great, but it just sort of depends on a lot of factors. As you know, every time you PCS to a different place, it can be awesome or it can be more challenging. Just sort of depends on where you are and taking it available. Yeah, and taking advantage of all the opportunities that provide based on where you are. Like living in Europe, being able to travel and do these things, but then all of a sudden you have kids and dogs and other challenges to make it a little more challenging. And how do you own those and how do you sort of make that happen? Evie, thank you so much for joining us on Coming Home Well.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to talk with you today.
Thanks for joining us this week on Coming Home Well with Dr. Tyler Piron. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and a review. Follow us on Instagram at ComingHomeWell_BTS or on Twitter at ComingHomeWell. Thanks again. And until all are home and all are well, this is Coming Home Well.